Well, June was quite a month. There's no doubt about June was hella crazy. And although we've seen a former president get hit with 37 criminal indictments, we've seen the likes of Rudy Giuliani finding their way in front of prosecutors to tell their side of the story. It means, in one sense, that Donald Trump is likely to be held, or finally being held accountable for his crimes and his behavior. We also saw a Supreme Court devolve further into corruption as more revelations about expensive trips and the lack of recusal from cases in which the donors and supporters of those trips and gifts had business before the court. We're seeing a court that is setting itself back in decades in terms of its support with the American people. So my guest today has some thoughts on that and knows firsthand of the importance of accountability and good ethics, as he has served as the former federal prosecutor with 30 years of trial experience. Glenn Kirschner also served in the U.S. Attorney's Office here in the District of Columbia for 24 years, and he is the host of Justice Matters with Glenn Kirschner, where he breaks down today's complex legal questions and issues in ways that are, quite frankly, understandable, which is why I'm glad he's going to be in conversation with us so that we can get a better understanding of all the political and legal machinations of Donald Trump, the Supreme Court, and the cases that revolve around them. So stay tuned for a great conversation coming up next with Glenn Kirschner right here on the Michael Steele Podcast. Hey, everybody, welcome to the Michael Steele Podcast. Yes, we are past the 4th of July and fireworks are done and we're midsummer. And this is the part where everybody, I guess, sort of takes a breath and goes to the beach and reads a book. I don't think so. No, because there's too much going on. My guest today is someone who clearly is not at the beach and is reading a book. He is trying to keep us all mindful of what road we're on and the direction we're headed. None other than Glenn Kirschner. Glenn, welcome to the podcast. Welcome back, man. It's good to have you.
Hey, Michael, great to be with you again.
You're looking good, baby. You know, how's that summer fun going?
Well, we survived all of the explosions last night on the 4th, but
Yep.
The explosions just keep on coming, don't they?
They do. And I think one of the things that I think a lot of folks out there appreciate from your analysis and the work you're doing, both on MSNBC and in your own podcast, Justice Matters, is sort of connecting important dots for people to kind of get a better understanding of the picture. And not just what the picture is at the moment, but what the picture could become and how it could take shape. At this midpoint, with the presidential campaigns underway, both for Democrats and Republicans, Donald Trump's, comeuppance, in other words, being held accountable under our legal system for certainly the documents issue, as well as January 6th. What's your assessment of the way the American people are reading where things are right now? How are they looking at it from your perspective?
It feels like we are broken up into tribes. I have always been a believer that there's no us and them in America, just different kinds of us.
Right.
I want to still believe that. But the problem is, if you are either unwilling or unable to discern between truth and fiction, and you're going to strike your loyalties and allegiances based on fiction, then I think it's really hard to sort of talk across the divide and persuade either side, persuading the other side. And Michael, when the term, either side comes out of my mouth, I cringe internally.
Right.
Because I can tell you, I was brought up in basically an apolitical household.
Right.
My pop was a high school football coach in New Jersey.
Right.
My mom, fiery little Irish woman, never went to college, but was a whole lot smarter than all of the rest of us put together. And we didn't do politics. But what we did, I'd like to think, was right and wrong, a respect for the rule of law, and a real hatred for corruption, particularly corruption by those in power, by those we entrust to represent our interests. So I'm a rule of law guy. And when I see, just in recent days, things like Joe Biden being interviewed by our mutual friend, Nicole Wallace, and being asked, Mr. President, are world leaders asking you, from democracies around the globe, asking you why it is the soldiers, her word, a word I often use, the foot soldiers of the insurrection, are being held accountable, are being prosecuted, are being imprisoned for what they did on January 6th. But the leader of the insurrection, Donald Trump, has not been held accountable. Are world leaders asking you why that is? And you could see President Biden take a beat. And then he said, look, my answer is yes. World leaders are asking him that. Now, let's couple that with what we saw in the last few days of Donald Trump posting on his third-rate social media platform President Obama's home address. What do we see? We see a Trump supporter / insurrectionist. I use that term advisedly because he was wanted for what he did at the Capitol on January 6th. Loading himself up for bear with 2 guns, 400 rounds of ammunition, a machete, and heading to President Obama's home address after he reposted Donald Trump's post with that address. And then today or yesterday, Donald Trump posted Jack Smith's got to be put down, got to be put to rest. Here's the thing, Michael. People will talk about how if you go after Trump, if you try to detain him pending trial, if you try to incarcerate him, convict him for his crimes, you're interfering in a political campaign. It's not interference if the person has committed crime after crime. It's not interference if the person presents a danger to the community, which is one of the reasons, one of the lawful reasons a judge can confine somebody pending trial. It's not interference if that person is on release pending trial in not 1 but 2 felony cases, 1 state and 1 federal. And somehow, if we apply the rule of law, we're interfering in a political campaign. That is nonsense, and it's an abdication of our law enforcement's responsibility to do what's right and then suffer whatever criticism comes.
How do we get so sideways on that? Is it the idea that, and I at this point have no regard for this argument. Well, this is just unprecedented. We've never been here before. I'm like, well, yeah, we've never had a president flout the law the way he has. We've never had a president steal classified documents and show them to people, off the street. I contend, admittedly, without proof or evidence, but knowing Donald Trump as I do, someone's paid him a pretty penny for some of those documents. And if you're trying to track down the documents, the ones you can't find, trust me, and someone has them. I mean, we've never had that. So why are we now put on the defensive about, to your very valid and important point, holding accountable the individual who's behaving that way, committing those offenses, has 37 felony counts brought against him, has lost in state court a sexual harassment and defamation case because he was adjudged to have sexually harassed and defamed a woman when she brought out those harassment charges. Why are we so protective and defensive of this guy? Not so much the individuals, because I think the general public feeds off the way the system, the structures respond to him. Why are they so hesitant to go after him? As we saw going back to, Mueller and his investigation. Oh, well, the department you shouldn't bring any charges. Why? You've already laid out 10 crimes. What? Just bring the damn case. I don't get it. Help me understand it.
Yeah, well, I think the most important word is unprecedented, which you just alluded to. People hear the word unprecedented and they view it as some sort of a hurdle or a stumbling block
Right.
or a road bump.
Right.
It's not. You just hit the nail right on the head. The reason we haven't had to prosecute a criminal former president is because nobody has done 1/100th of the dirt that Donald Trump did. Michael, if we had to have precedent to bring every legal case, every prosecution we've ever brought, we never would have prosecuted anything. Right. You have to do everything for the first time before it's no longer unprecedented.
Exactly.
But here's what I know, Michael, from 30 years inside the federal government, nearly a quarter of a century of that time in the Department of Justice. Prosecutors don't like to do things that are unprecedented because then they will be criticized as having nefarious motives for doing it. There will be a risk of failure. And let me tell you, Michael, if there's one thing that federal prosecutors hate, and many of them are scared to death of, it's failure, it's embarrassment, it's criticism. And I have seen the timidity of the Department of Justice for decades, and I fought against it. I brought unprecedented cases in the courts of Washington, D.C. Right. Sometimes I won, sometimes I lost, but I always believed it was the right thing to do on the facts, on the law, to try to deal with the victimization of people, to try to protect the community, and try to stretch the rule of law in appropriate ways. Sometimes I won in the trial court, and it ended up making precedent that we use to this day on what's called the urban gun battle theory of homicide liability in Washington, D.C., when two groups of young people, generally young men, take up arms, start engaging in a gun battle in a crowded urban area, putting innocent bystanders at risk. Well, the law now, courtesy of our maiden voyage, is that everybody can be on the hook for second-degree depraved heart murder, regardless of whose bullet struck the innocent bystander. That was an expansion. We took a chance. I could have fallen flat on my face, but I was willing to take that chance, and I was willing to suffer the criticism that you can't do that, never been done before, unprecedented. I said, just watch me. If it's wrong, the courts are going to say it's wrong. But they didn't say it was wrong. Now, I've had as many failures, Michael, trust me. We would need another couple of hours as I've had successes. But that's what we're here for. That's what you sign up for.
Right. That is the key thing. And, if you are grounded in the law, you're grounded in the facts, and you're grounded in sort of in your role as a prosecutor, the role of the judge, the role of the jury, everybody doing their part the right way, you're exactly on point. If you are off base in any of the elements that you bring before that judge and that jury, you'll know it. They'll tell you. There's no embarrassment in that. There's nothing wrong with that unless you're just a gadfly prosecutor, in which case you certainly wouldn't be serving on the DC circuit. You wouldn't be prosecuting in those courts. So you bring your credibility and your ability to recognize the case for what it is, regardless of who the defendant is. And I think what's happened is we've kind of gotten sort of awestruck and dumbstruck at the same time by the fact that here we have this former president who, while president, engaged in behavior that is unbecoming. So what do we do with that? Well, my view of it is you do what you would do with any other person. You prosecute them if it's prosecutable, or you let them go if there's no case. But you've got to go through the chain of accountability to see where this individual matter falls. I think the work, to your point, that's being done now lays the ground for a future rogue president, a future criminal president, to be duly prosecuted and appropriately prosecuted without all the drama and histrionics. So I can sort of give a little bit of ground on that. But I think at this point, given the nefarious nature of this man's behavior and what he's done, I mean, Glenn, there is no downside in holding him accountable. In fact, the system begs that you do. So when you're looking at, for example, the release of the audio tape of Trump actually saying, yeah, I should have probably declassified this, but I can't now. So here, take a look. What is your prosecutor sense tells you about the case at this point? And I suspect that there's probably more that hasn't been released that likely would get released during a trial that Jack Smith right now is going, you can't be this stupid, but okay, I'll play.
Yeah, we probably know about 10% of the incriminating evidence that Jack Smith has developed before the grand jury. So
wow.
There's a lot more to come. There's a lot more
little bit.
shoes to drop. Yeah, that's what I believe based on my decades of investigating in the grand jury, how much leaked out. I know this is different. This is unusual, but
right.
But here's the thing. First of all, there's some good news, and then there's some things that keep me up at night. The good news is, when I had RICO prosecutions, for example, where some of our evidence included wiretap evidence, we had audio recordings of the very defendants on trial sitting across the courtroom with 12 people, 12 citizens in that wooden box staring them down. Right. And you could hear in the defendant's own voice, I'm going to need 10 kilos on Friday. You got me? You got me? The jury is like, when do we get to the deliberating part so we can convict this person? I call it a just press play trial. Here's the good news. Donald Trump will be convicted of these documents crimes. Here's what keeps me up at night. Donald Trump has to be indicted for the insurrection because there's a deep injustice at play in this country every minute of every day until he gets charged. He and his criminal associates, right. the ruling class criminals, the upper echelon of the insurrection. There are people that he ordered to attack the Capitol in no uncertain terms who are in prison right now. And the person who gave the order is holding fundraisers and going to dinner parties and, posting all his hate on his social media platform. That's a deep injustice at play right now that has to be remedied by a prosecution being brought against the hierarchy of the insurrection. I believe Jack Smith will absolutely get us there. I also think we're likely to see charges in New York for that tape that you just mentioned. He's on tape in New Jersey, not New York, in New Jersey, in Bedminster, committing the crime,
right,
and taking defenses away from his own attorneys by saying, I didn't declassify this as president. I probably should have. I can't do it now. And by the way, it's still secret. And then in a separate conversation, which is not on that audio recording, but it's part of the indictment that was unsealed in Florida, he's showing one of his campaign operatives a classified military operations map, and he said, yeah, but don't get too close to it because it's classified. What is this, a video game you're playing? Right. So, but here's the part that keeps me up at night, and it's two things, Michael. One, if Donald Trump is not indicted for the insurrection, every president moving forward every 4 years gets to do exactly what Donald Trump did on January 6th, and he gets Merrick Garland as a running mate to do it. If I were Donald Trump running for re-election, or I would pull a cardboard cutout of Merrick Garland up on stage and drape my arm around it and say, he co-signed for everything I did on January 6th because he didn't charge me for anything. Now, I know Jack Smith is now in the picture, thank goodness, because he's going scorched earth, and I think he's going to get there. But declining to prosecute Trump is giving permission, encouragement, in fact, for every president every 4 years to do it all over again.
Can I get a quick sidebar on that point?
Yeah.
Do you think that Merrick Garland is either now looking at, or at the time was looking for, an off-ramp that would allow a third party in the form of a Jack Smith, special prosecutor, to bring the elements of a charge or the elements together in a way to make a charge against Trump, so he didn't have to fall into that trap of using the department, given all the crap the department's been going through, have to deal with this idea that it is politicized to the point where this prosecution would be more political than actually judicial?
Yeah, it's a great question. I can't look into AG Garland's mind to see if he was looking for an off-ramp. I do feel like that might have been in the back of his mind because his determination to keep the department from looking political
Right.
actually, in my opinion, led to him
Made it look more
de
political.
declining to bring charges for political reasons,
Right.
right? Rather than just on the facts and the law. I think it probably made matters a lot easier for him once Trump announced his candidacy, which made him a direct opponent of Merrick Garland's boss, Joe Biden.
Right.
So Garland had nowhere to go but to appoint a special counsel. Thank goodness he appointed one who was going scorched earth in the direction of accountability and justice. So I think we're in much better shape now with Jack Smith heading up the investigation. Here's the and
What's
I,
the
you know,
second thing that
really,
keeps you up?
oh, this one's bad. This one's bad. So what we know is that Donald Trump committed lots of crimes while in office. And why is it that we're reluctant to prosecute presidents or former presidents? One reason is because we have this horrific opinion, the Office of Legal Counsel memo that says,
Yes.
we don't think it's a good idea to
Yes.
prosecute a sitting criminal president. We're not going to do it. We're going to say it's verboten. First of all, that's the stuff of banana republics, because literally he could call in his political opponent, shoot him in the head, and say, can't prosecute me. That's
Right.
DOJ's considered opinion. That carries over a little bit atmospherically, if not legally. That carries over to when that president, who's been committing crimes all along, leaves the office.
Right.
But here's the part that keeps me up. We know for
that part didn't keep you up.
No, I'm getting there. I'm getting there. I'm still nodding off. The nightmare is about to come into focus. So we know that Donald Trump, for example, bribed and extorted President Zelensky by unlawfully withholding congressional funds and leveraging them for a dirty political favor. Just announce an investigation into the Bidens. You don't have to conduct one. Just announce it and leave the rest to me and my Republican allies, which, Michael, is exactly what he said about the election. Doesn't matter that there was no fraud. Just say there was and leave it up to me and my Republican allies in Congress. Those are crimes. The first one is extortion and bribery, using congressional funds unlawfully as leverage. That should have been indicted the minute Donald Trump left office. But because Merrick Garland, once he came on board in March, he wasn't there on January 20th, opted to let that slide, to turn a blind eye. What does that do, Michael? It gives every president permission, DOJ's stamp of approval, to use congressionally appropriated funds as leverage against world leaders for dirty political favors, because Merrick Garland said it's just fine. I'm not bringing charges. And the same is true of the multiple counts of federal felony obstruction of justice that Bob Mueller meticulously documented in Volume 2 of the Trump-Russia report, and about which Bob Mueller testified. He can be charged on the day he leaves office, but he hasn't been. What does that do? It gives the next president permission to obstruct justice all over again. Those are the things I don't know that we can endure over the long run as a nation.
I think that's an appropriate nightmare scenario, because the reality of it is, how do you then prosecute that president? How do you then say, oh no, now that's a crime? I'm sorry. You're calling up the president of X country and saying, hey, could you give me some dirt on my political opponent for the upcoming election? And when you do, that those missiles that you've been hankering for the last 3 years, well, they may find their way to your doorstep. You can't prosecute. I mean, how do you prosecute that at that point? Because you've allowed it to happen in the past. So suddenly you get religion. So that kind of begs the question: how do you prosecute a president in the future who calls up the president of a country and says, hey, those missiles that you've been hankering for, I've already talked to Congress. That's all taken care of. Oh, by the way, could you give me whatever dirt you have from my political opponent's last visit to your country? Be very helpful. How do you then prosecute that question of using the congressional funds or appropriations for political gains and gamesmanship. How do you do it? You can't. And so it begs for me the ultimate question: what do you think, or will the DOJ get over itself and take that memo and have a wonderful little bonfire in the middle of Pennsylvania Avenue, to make it clear to both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, the Congress and the White House? I'm sorry, we no longer look at this idea of not prosecuting a sitting president or a former president for crimes committed. All the other elements of the rule of law, Glenn, apply. So bring the facts, bring the evidence. We'll run it through what we need to run it through, like we would with any potential criminal defendant. And if it merits a prosecution, we'll prosecute, because this idea that I'm sitting in the Oval Office committing this crime is just as disruptive to the business of the country and the rule of law and all those other elements that people would whine about as the actual prosecution itself.
Yeah, I don't know that. I wish I was optimistic that the Department of Justice would revisit that horrific OLC memo. I don't know that it will, but what it does, again, you put your finger on it, because they let Trump crime with impunity while in office, both misusing congressional funds for a dirty political favor and obstructing justice up to 10 times over and over and over and over again to protect his own interests. It's going to be very hard to do it to the next president, particularly if the next president happens to be from another party. It's going to be like, wait, you didn't go after that president's crimes, but you're going to go after this president's crimes. There's something called selective prosecution, which I teach to my criminal justice students at George Washington University. Yeah, it's a high bar, but there are all kinds of defenses that somebody could lodge by saying, wait a minute. You already announced that these things would not be prosecuted against the sitting president, so therefore I'm free to do them. You can't come after me for them. Now, that may be a losing argument, but here's what it is. It's another argument that the Department of Justice will use to convince itself that they should never prosecute any president while in office, regardless of how egregious his crimes. I don't know how long our nation can endure that.
So a couple of more elements of this Trump prosecution I want to tap into before we bring it to some of the domestic and political decisions played out in the Supreme Court ruling over the past week. You've had some very powerful words on that I want to get into. But before I do, what's your assessment of one more piece on Trump? And it's very interesting when I read this quote from you. I was like, I definitely got to ask him about this. You stated that Trump could end up dying in prison. And a lot of people just don't believe the man will ever go to prison for a lot of the reasons we just talked about. Why do you believe that as all of this plays itself out, that whether it is in 2024 and I don't think Trump will get elected president in 24 regardless. So subsequent in 2025 or beyond, that Trump winds up actually in prison in a jumpsuit.
So the reason I'm more confident of that now than I have been for a long time, at least since November when Jack Smith was appointed as special counsel, is because when you look at Smith's body of work as the head of the public integrity section at the Department of Justice in The Hague, he has lived the life of pursuing people without fear or favor. He and his team have prosecuted Democrats, they've prosecuted Republicans. Some of those cases he won, some of those cases, more importantly, he lost, but he knew he didn't lose them. They hung, and then they opted not to rebring the charges against Edwards and Menendez. And give me a prosecutor who's willing to take the really difficult, politically charged case, politically challenging case to trial at the risk of losing because he or she knows it's the right thing to do. That's the prosecutor I want to get in the foxhole with and fight the enemy being those who violate the law and abuse the public trust. So that, I think, coupled with the fact that I have to say some of my former homicide prosecutors from the DC U.S. Attorney's Office are over on Jack Smith's team.
Right.
And I think very highly of them because they are all as honorable and ethical and unafraid as a prosecutor can get. I think we're going to get to the right place. I also have faith in our jury system. I spent 30 years standing up in front of juries. I believe they take their oath seriously when they say, I will set aside any biases, any ideology, any political preferences or aversions I have, and I will decide this case based only on the evidence. I am confident that he's going to be prosecuted for multiple crimes. He's going to be held accountable. And I just don't think after he is convicted of criminal offenses that carry lots and lots and lots of prison time, that some judge is going to say, yeah, but you know what? I'm going to sentence you to binge watch Netflix and order DoorDash, home confinement. That's no kind of punishment. That's literally zero punishment. And I think our judiciary by and large has held strong, not talking so much about the Supreme Court. We can talk about their problems. But, in the election arena, they have not really thrown Trump any bones in the way they've ruled from the election challenge cases all the way up to the Supreme Court. And I actually think, Michael, if I can get snarky at the Supreme Court for a minute, I think that's because they are so self-interested that the last thing they're going to do is set up circumstances that would install a dictator in the White House. Why? Because the dictator has no interest in a Supreme Court.
No, he doesn't. No.
So,
yeah.
That's why.
They become an
immediate
immediate obstacle.
Yeah,
they
they're
become
looking
an
out for their own
obstacle.
behinds is what they're doing.
Exactly. What's your take on the cavalcade is a strong word to use, but it's always a fun word when it comes to people who find themselves trying to fall over each other to line up to get to some place. And I'm referring to all of the possible criminal co-defendants of Donald Trump now finding their way, talking to prosecutors, in particular Rudy Giuliani, making his case now. How are you assessing that? What does that tell you? One, about the approach, and you've sort of alluded to that already, of Jack Smith, for example, in prosecuting the cases. He's got January 6th and the documents. And what does it say about these potential criminal co-defendants and their nervousness about, oh, okay, Donald Trump may not go to jail, but my ass sure likely will.
Yeah. So, Jack Smith is really going 100 miles an hour and he's fearless. And you can see that because let me tell you, Michael, rarely do we put the defense attorney who represents the target of the grand jury investigation into the grand jury. Because there's this thing called attorney-client privilege that we usually can't get around. So we don't try to get around it because it's not the right thing to do unless the target of the investigation is using his lawyers in furtherance of committing crimes.
Right.
Jack Smith has fought every legal battle, many of them in front of the former chief judge of the DC federal court, Beryl Howell, or the current chief judge, James Boasberg, who was one of my homicide prosecutors back in the day. I tried murder cases with Jeb. He's a hell of a judge, a hell of a man, and he's going to get these calls right. And Jack Smith has set it all up and knocked it all down. He's put a vice president in the grand jury who desperately didn't want to have to testify about the crimes of Donald Trump. He's put most of Donald Trump's defense attorneys in the grand jury providing incriminating information about their former client. And now he's got Rudy Giuliani coming in for a proffer session. What's a proffer session? Well, that's when we know somebody's committed a rack of crimes, but we say, we want to talk to you. Come on in. We're going to give you immunity for the day. You're going to tell us everything you did and Trump did. And then we're going to see what kind of a plea offer with cooperation we're going to extend to you. Right. So listen, there's nothing we can ask of special counsel Jack Smith that he hasn't already done, except charge Donald Trump for the balance of his document crimes and for the insurrection.
We are having. I've been looking forward to this conversation. I've always been a huge admirer of Glenn Kirschner. He's just one of the smartest guys, balanced and just logical in his explanation of some very complicated legal stuff, folks. I'm hoping everybody's appreciating this conversation. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back. We've already sort of mentioned the Supreme Court in its rulings. We're going to get into some of that because my man Glenn had some very powerful words to share about that. More with Glenn Kirschner right after this. Welcome back, everybody, to the Michael Steele Podcast. We are talking with my good buddy, Glenn Kirschner, who is the host of Justice Matters with Glenn Kirschner, and MSNBC legal analyst and professor extraordinaire at George Washington University. George Washington, right? Or GW.
George
Washington, yeah. Right. So I before we went to break, I mentioned Supreme Court, which let's say this week they didn't disappoint, that's for sure. They brought out passions on all sides with their rulings. Let's start with the affirmative action case. You had some very strong words on that case regarding the impact that it has beyond just the sheer idea of affirmative action. The lack of historical appreciation of the journey of African Americans and people of color in this country, the rationale behind carving out this space for those folks who have been historically, economically, politically, and otherwise disenfranchised. Share with us a little bit of your thinking on this decision that gutted and ostensibly eliminates affirmative action in the academic setting. I think sets up eliminating affirmative action in the business sector as well.
Yeah, so the Supreme Court has basically cemented the sort of systemic racism and disadvantage that we all know has been in existence since, the nation was born in slavery and built on the backs of slaves. It kind of goes without saying that if you have a population that you enslave, that you deny all of the not only constitutional rights but human rights,
right?
You deny them the right to own anything, property or anything else. You deny people the right to accumulate wealth. So therefore, by extension, you deny them the opportunity to make their children's lives better moving forward. And that wasn't so long ago. As I said, hell, everything was separate but equal until 1954. And we all know it wasn't equal at that point either. But this is our recent history. You have deprived people of equal opportunity. Mm-hmm. And now the Supreme Court has cemented that circumstance. And they are saying it doesn't matter. We will forever deprive you of the opportunity to just catch up. What we're going to do is we're going to take other populations that didn't have any of those hardships or deprivations or abuses or adversities in their history, and we're going to say you have to compete against all of them with no recognition of the deprivations that we made sure to inflict upon you for the generations. How in the F is that fair, decent, equal protection? How is it constitutional? I mean, it was an outcome-oriented opinion, decision, right, that the Supreme Court was hell-bent on getting to, and I'll be damned if they didn't get there.
What do you make of the High Court's use of the first form of affirmative action in the 14th Amendment to undo affirmative action? I mean, I can get into the political side and my problem that I've been battling inside the GOP since I first joined the party in the 1970s. with helping them understand that we have been always been the architect and the authors of affirmative action legislation in this country. We have. And, you know, from 40 acres and a mule in the post-Reconstruction era, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, civil rights legislation in the 1960s. The GOP has always kind of been in that space. In fact, modern day affirmative action was the created by Art Fletcher, you know, one of the secretaries for Richard Nixon in the Department of Commerce back in the late 1960s. He's considered the father, Black African-American Republican, the father of modern day affirmative action, and yet the party found itself tearing at it, using white grievance as the basis, you know, reverse discrimination. I don't know what kind of bullshit that is, but I don't know how you have reverse discrimination against the majority that owns the economic, political, and educational systems in this country. Okay, I'll play. But then to use the 14th Amendment and for Roberts and his court to distort that, to me, I can't rationally come around on that. Maybe you can help us see the legal nexus there.
No, I can't explain the inexplicable. And I used to argue that to my juries all the time, because in every case I tried, there were a couple of inexplicable facts and circumstances. And I would say, you know, folks, listen, if I had to, as a prosecutor, explain the inexplicable to your satisfaction, nobody'd ever be held accountable for any of their crimes, right? So, but what the Supreme Court has done is they take the 14th Amendment, they turn it on its head, and they take something that was designed to deal with inequality, and they use it to cement the very inequality it was designed to alleviate. Yes. That is what the Supreme Court has done. And Michael, here's the thing, because there's no oversight, because there's no code of ethics, because they are, and I don't say this lightly, and it makes my heart ache, they are a conflicted, compromised, and corrupt Supreme Court. Many of the justices, and they lied to us during their confirmation hearings. They fell all over themselves, saying how much they respect settled precedent, stare decisis. It's been decided and affirmed several times over. It's worthy of respect. What were they saying to us? They were saying most directly, if you confirm me, Roe versus Wade has nothing to worry about from me. And I think by extension, you could apply that to affirmative action and LGBTQ rights and other areas where there was some precedent on the books for a very long time trying to move our society forward, particularly when you apply evolving societal norms, as is part of constitutional interpretation. They lied to us, and they have not been held accountable for their lies. And they expose their own lies because they're not as smart as they think they are. When Alito writes something like, Roe was egregiously wrongly decided from the moment it was handed down. Well, thank you, Alito, because you just put your own lie to your confirmation testimony, because you said the exact opposite. But here's where we go back to the rule of law, Michael. If we are unwilling to hold them accountable for lying under oath during their Senate confirmation hearings, each time they did it, it was a 5-year offense under 18 U.S.C. 1001. If we're unwilling, then we get precisely what we just got from the Supreme Court, revoking or cutting back on the rights of all sorts of people and populations, whether it's women, whether it's African Americans, people of color, whether it's the LGBTQ community. That's what we get because we refuse to hold the ruling class criminals accountable.
How do you, I have a sense I know where you're going to go on this one. The affirmative action case was just mind-numbingly painful and stupid and disregarded, as you aptly put out, precedent beyond precedent. But then you get to the next case, which is the website case, where you have a plaintiff who says, I may want to, at some point in the future, I'm not sure when, possibly, but then again, I could change my mind. But I don't know. I really do think I'm considering building a website for wedding planners to come. But if I do that in the future, maybe, possibly, I'm not sure yet, I don't want to have to build a website for a gay couple. So, Supreme Court, I need you to tell me I don't have to do that if I decide at some point in the future, possibly, but I'm not sure yet because I haven't built the website yet. So no one's been harmed, but I could be harmed in the future. So can you help a sister out?
Yeah, let's talk about explaining the inexplicable. And apparently the person that she named as Stewart, who was the guy who kind of sort of might want
Yes.
a website, doesn't exist. He's like, I didn't do any of that.
Well,
So there
not
is
only
no...
that, he's married.
Yeah.
He's not gay. He's got kids. Oh, and here's the kicker. Go ahead. You say it. You go ahead.
He's a website developer. Yeah, so there is no case or controversy as is required in the Constitution if the judiciary even has the authority to wade in to this. But here is what this decision boils down to for me. This is the Supreme Court saying, if you cloak your intolerance, your prejudice, and your hatred of others in either your religion or your right to artistic expression, you can discriminate against whoever you damn well please.
That's so well. I'm going to pull that clip for y'all folks, because that just summed up. That is it right there. You have nailed exactly not just the intent, but the outcome right there.
And you know what, though, Michael? We may not be at the end. I'm happy to talk with you all day long, but the silver lining behind this enormous black stinking cloud of the Supreme Court, at least 6 of the justices, is that if you think we were pissed in November 2020, wait until November 2024, because I will never get over that women's constitutional privacy rights have been revoked. That now, over their objection and absent their consent, a handful of Supreme Court justices said, we will make your reproductive decisions for you. Thank you very much. If that doesn't drive people to the polls, if this doesn't drive people of color and everybody who gives a rat's ass about fairness for everybody to the polls, if it doesn't drive our LGBTQ community and everybody who cares about them to the polls, come on now. You ain't seen nothing yet in November 2020. I absolutely believe that. That is the silver lining.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. And it was interesting to hear the president, I think, appropriately state out of the gate in his conversation with Nicole Wallace that, tinkering with the number of justices on the Supreme Court will have a far worse political outcome, could create more harm than good. But I do think that now the court has fairly gravitated attention towards it, as reflected by sinking from some 75% of approval by the American people to, I think on a good day now, 32%. I've seen as low as 27% of the American people approving of this court, which in the past people looked at as being fair, as looked at as that the ultimate check and balance in our system rested there. When you have a court that is so clear in its lack of ethics or in even a desire to resolve the ethical questions that have been borne out by the behavior of certain justices. And then, of course, as you pointed out, saying in their confirmation hearings that stare decisis, precedent matters. We may or may not agree with the politics of it. That's not our job. Our job is to respect what our brethren and sisters of the courts in the past have decided, to say, the hell with that, bitch. We got this now. what do you see as the future of the court? How does it fix itself? If the ballot box certainly will be a way, so electing folks who have a different view of the court and the role it should play is one outcome. But do you think the court has it in itself to fix itself here? Because I know Roberts well enough to know that's a desire, but the outcome just hasn't worked out that to meet that desire, in my view.
Yeah, I don't think the court is capable of fixing itself. Listen, anytime you let an organization fix itself, address its own abuses, I think of police departments that run roughshod and are asked to police themselves. How well does that typically turn out? And we don't let police departments that we suspect of being involved in systemic racism and civil rights abuses. We try to insert the Department of Justice in there for pattern or practice investigations, and they police the police departments that need that sort of oversight. Organizations have a very hard time policing themselves, and I don't think the Supreme Court has any interest or inclination to police itself. They like being above it all and untouchable. I am a proponent of the 13 justices for a couple of reasons. First of all, over the years, we have increased the number of federal court judges to accommodate the explosion in caseloads, and federal judges are still horrifically overworked. They can barely keep their heads above water given the caseloads that they are drowning in. Well, you know what? The same could be said of the Supreme Court. First of all, they only take a fraction of cases that are petitioned for review, in part, I believe, because they don't have the bandwidth to take all of the righteous cases that probably should be given a look by the Supreme Court. But we have 13 federal jurisdictions. We've expanded to 13 jurisdictions. It's supposed to be one judge with some supervisory responsibilities over those 13 jurisdictions. But look at the list. Some of the judges have to double up, do double duty. And I also, if you look at the history of our nation, we have had as few as 5 Supreme Court justices. Yeah. We have had as many as 10 Supreme Court justices. 9 is not a magic number. I think there is every reason, if only to keep up with the increase in population and caseloads, to increase the number of justices exactly as we have done for federal court judges below the Supreme Court. So, and to, I think, try to address the abuses of the Trump-McConnell era. Here's what I always point to, Michael. When we know that Trump and McConnell ignored the ABA ratings of judges, whether they were qualified, fully qualified, highly qualified, qualified, or not qualified. They don't go with unqualified. I don't know why. So, and here is what President Obama did when he was deciding who he might want to nominate to the federal bench. He would ask the ABA for its opinion. And in every instance where the ABA said not qualified, President Obama did not nominate that person. That's the way good governing is supposed to work. Trump and McConnell told the ABA, take a flying leap. We'll put as many not qualified judges on there if we think they will do our dirty ideological work for us.
They put people on the bench who never tried a case. On the federal bench. I mean, not like you're a trial court judge, right? No, they put people on the federal bench who had never stepped foot in a courtroom, let alone tried a case. How the hell do you put someone on? How do you say that individual is qualified? And then the sort of check on that by the legislative branch, the Senate, confirm these numbnuts. Yeah. So you're absolutely right on that. The way you described the sort of 13 seat court makes a lot of sense in when you look at it in terms, well, now they each have a jurisdiction that they are, you don't have the double up. It does alleviate some of the pressures on the court system itself. And I think that's something, I think a future president is going to look at that. They have to. I just know when they do, it's just going to be in the context of so much politics. It's going to be stupid. But that's where we are. But the process needs to clean itself up, and Justice Roberts needs to take control of this court by saying, you know what, have a little conversation with Alito and Thomas and others, and say, that's it, we're done, no more. I mean, if you get a matchbook, you are to disclose it. And because you're not going to get that trust back. It's just not going to happen unless there's affirmative actions by the court. They're affirmative action.
Pun intended, yeah.
by the court to fix it. Glenn Kirschner, I told you guys, he's one of the smartest ones out there, who's steeped in this stuff. Former federal prosecutor for 30 years, certainly someone who knows the U.S. Attorney's Office here in the District of Columbia because he was there for 24. And also the work that he's doing out there, keeping us all apprised on his own accord through Justice Matters with Glenn Kirschner. Thanks, man, for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Michael. Keep preaching. Keep preaching. We're in the fight of our lives. We're in the fight of our lives.
Absolutely, my friend. Follow Glenn, folks, on Twitter, such that Twitter still exists. If you're happy to follow, we didn't even get into that stupid. At Glenn Kirschner 2. Follow the podcast at Steele_podcast. Follow me at Michael Steele. It's summertime. Go out and enjoy it, folks, because we're going to need you ready and primed for what comes starting in the fall, leading up to next year's election. So we're going to continue the conversation, as Glenn noted, trying to make you smarter and better prepared to deal with stupid. That's what it's all about. Until next time, be well.